There we go. All right. So, donor advised funds is becoming a very increasingly popular tool in philanthropy, specifically for news organizations. And it's a topic that keeps coming up often in several of our conversations around the communities with the Lenfest Institute and our members and our folks. So we thought this would be a good time for us to start the conversation. And today in the room, we have two magnificent experts joining us who are going to be sharing some of their expertise with us. We have Vicky Kelberer, who's the senior manager and product owner at Vanguard Charitable. Vicky is going to be walking us through how journalism of nonprofits can build sustainable giving strategies with DAFs. And then we have Allison Levine, who is the publisher and CEO of Spotlight Delaware. Allison also spent over 10 years or so working with the Delaware Community Foundation. And so she's going to be sharing insights on how we can engage with community foundations. So with that, we are very happy to have you both here. We're going to hear from Vicky first and then from Allison, and we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A and questions. So feel free to post your questions on the chat as we go. With that, I'm going to let Vicky take it from here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Diana. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Are we good?
Excellent.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that intro, Diana, and thank you to the Lenfest Institute and everyone for joining today. Hopefully this gives you a break from the cold. Lisa, I saw your chat. I'm originally from Minnesota. I now live in Delaware, so I really do not miss those winters. But we are not here to talk about the weather today. We are here to talk about how you can build sustainable fundraising relationships with donor advised fund donors. And as Diana mentioned, I work with the donor advised fund sponsor, Vanguard Charitable. We are one of the larger national donor advised funds located in Pennsylvania, so just outside of Philadelphia. And I've been with the organization now for about 7 years. And before this, I did work on the other side of the fundraising table with direct service nonprofits in refugee policy as well as higher education. So I always like to say if I had known about donor advised funds when I was doing fundraising, my job would have been a lot easier. So hopefully I'll be able to give you guys some practical tips today, as well as some basic information to understand, first and foremost, what is a donor advised fund, which you'll see me refer to throughout as DAFs. That's just a much easier acronym to say than that mouthful of donor advised fund. I'll also talk about the opportunity of giving from DAFs, why do donors use donor advised funds, and how do nonprofits benefit? And then finally, I think probably for this group, the most important part, which is, what are some practical steps that you can take today, tomorrow, next week, since it is Thursday, with your organization to create a DAF fundraising strategy. So first and foremost, what is a donor advised fund? How do these vehicles work? Despite the somewhat complex sounding name, I actually think that donor advised funds can be really simple if you think about them in the right way. So I often compare donor advised funds to other types of designated investment accounts, except for a DAF is designated legally for charitable giving. You can think of this kind of like, for instance, a retirement account or a college savings account. Operates in a really similar way. It is just specifically and very importantly, legally designated for charitable giving. So how it works is individuals, corporations, other entities, they make a decision that they'd like to start one of these funds. And the first step that they take is they contribute funds into that donor advised fund. Once the money is there, it is legally, again, designated for charities, meaning it belongs to the DAF sponsor at that point, not the donor. And that's where the advised part comes in. These funds are advised by these donors, but not owned by them. Once it's in those funds, we also invest that money and it grows over time. And all of that growth, all of the money in the account, all of that is designated for charities. And can be given away tax-free. So you're not paying capital gains tax, for instance, since it's going directly to nonprofits from that sponsor. And then the last step, which actually happens throughout the life of the donor advised fund, you see there's more money now within the account to give away to charities. And that's really the magic of a donor advised fund. People have the ability to give away more over time because of those investments, and because they're able to grow that money in the fund over time. I'm seeing the volume is low in the chat. Is that for everyone? Is everyone able to hear me?
I was going to point out, because I hear you fine, but I'm wondering if other folks are having an issue. Nope. So it might be your computer.
Thanks, everyone. So much help from the group. Thank you so much. All right, so that's what a donor advised fund is. I think a natural next question that we often get is, who are the donor advised funds, right? Like, what is a donor advised fund sponsor? And you'll frequently hear that there's really three main types of donor advised fund sponsors. So the first is the national charities. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Vanguard Charitable is a national sponsor of donor advised funds, meaning that we serve donors that are giving across all different cause areas and geographies. And we belong to this group of about 73 national charities as of 2023. The largest group of sponsors, which Allison's going to be going into in detail later. So I'm not going to get too much into community foundations, but that's our wonderful community foundation. So these are sponsors which are designating their activities within a specific geography or community. And these are actually the oldest types of donor advised funds. This is really who started the donor advised fund vehicle. And then finally, we've got single issue charities. So a little over 340 of these. As the name suggests, these are sponsors that are helping donors to give in a specific way or to a specific cause area or even specific charity. So examples of these would include, organizations that are focused on impact investing as the way that they want their donors to give. Or even donor advised funds that are sponsored by universities. A lot of universities have DAFs attached to their fundraising arms now. And they have usually some restriction around some of those funds going to that cause, that university, whichever issue they have as part of their mission. So altogether, a little bit more than, I think, 1,200 sponsors today. And out of all of those sponsors, as of 2023, donor advised fund donors are granting about $55 billion to charities. So it is a really large source of funding for nonprofits at this point, and it's growing faster than any other giving vehicle. So the opportunity is pretty big, and it is growing pretty swiftly year over year. So speaking of that opportunity, a lot of folks then ask me, okay, great. Why do donors use these vehicles, right? We get how it works, but what are some of the benefits compared to other things which might operate somewhat similarly, such as a private foundation or a trust would be some common examples. Well, on the donor side of things, donor advised funds tend to be really convenient for donors in that they provide a one-stop shop for all of your giving. Most of our donors are coming to Vanguard Charitable and other sponsors with already established giving patterns. They've got lots of charities they support, but a DAF really gives them the ability to centralize that in one place. The second piece that we find is really important to donors is that DAF sponsors tend to be one of the lowest cost giving vehicles or ways of giving to charities. So while you might see, private foundations and other types of giving vehicles have pretty high cost to operate, donor advised fund fees tend to be very, very low. So, with Vanguard Charitable, for instance, our average fee is less than 1% of the assets each year. And that can even be lower for donors than giving via, for instance, online transactions, which sometimes charge up to 5%, right, off the top of that grant to give to charities. So it's a low cost way to give to charities. You've also got the ease of use, right? All of your tax receipts in one place, all of your giving reporting in one place. So it makes it just really easy to enact a giving strategy. And I think a big piece of that is the ease with which people can give donor advised funds non-cash assets and increasingly things that would be considered a bit more complex, like cryptocurrency or real estate or privately held companies. And donor advised funds obviously also offer that ability to grow those non-cash assets through investment growth. And then finally, a lot of DAF donors come and work with us because they're interested in creating a long-term giving strategy, not just giving sort of here and there when they're asked, when they're not.
Eat some more soup. Did Vicky freeze for everyone else? Okay, so
Yes.
maybe her connection is. All right. Yeah, it looks like her connection is a little bit unstable, so it's possible that she might have to rejoin us at some point. Okay, so in the meantime, if there is any questions for Vicky, feel free to post them on the chat, and then after her presentation, she's gonna be able to answer. And in the meantime, I don't know if Allison, you wanna go ahead and do yours, and then maybe we can circle back to Vicky. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and share your presentation, if that's okay.
Sure. That sounds great.
Give me a second. All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pop back to the beginning here. And I see an important question in here that somebody wrote for Vicky that I think I should address, is that one of the reasons that people put money in DAFs is partly so that they have a level of anonymity. And sometimes that means that they are really hard to research. But I see Vicky has managed to rejoin us. So should we go back to her presentation? Let her finish first?
Sure. Vicky, are you ready to continue?
Absolutely. I don't know what happened. It kicked me out momentarily.
All right. Do you want to put up yours?
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Always great figuring out the Zoom technology. Anyways, thanks for vamping while I was offline. But I was just getting into how nonprofits benefit from giving from donor advised funds. So I think first and foremost, there's really very rarely applications or reporting that are required from nonprofits to access these grants. You are typically only having to do a normal individual fundraising strategy to reach out to these donors, which would have been music to my ears. Again, when I was in that fundraising seat, writing 50-page applications for a $500 grant, you just don't see that as frequently with donor advised funds, unless they're a really specific type of grant making program through those funds. You also see that nonprofits benefit from the fact that donors are getting the fees taken out of their overall assets and not the grants themselves. So the full amount of the grant that they intend to make to your nonprofit is going directly to you in the form of a check or electronic payment. We also see that there is a much higher rate of unrestricted giving from donor advised funds. So for Vanguard Charitable, for instance, about 3/4 or more of our grants go out without any restrictions at all on the purpose, and more than half of the dollars. That's compared to the overall space of giving, where only about 20% of dollars go out unrestricted. And so through education as well as policy, you see that trend really hold across the donor advised fund space, that you're just more likely to get unrestricted gifts. We also have a much higher average gift amount. So I think, when you're seeing donor advised fund gifts come in, or that you've got donors who use donor advised funds, that's a really great indicator that that's a major gift opportunity. Our average single grant is worth about $10,000. So tends to be a pretty sizable gift amount compared to, again, other forms of giving. And then the final piece is, of course, that long-term strategy. That's one of the reasons donors come to give through us. And I think also can be a huge benefit to know as a fundraiser that this is somebody who's made an upfront commitment to giving. They're going to be in it for the long haul. This is very likely not going to be a one-off giver. And so you can take advantage of those types of relationships to be really sustaining your fundraising strategy with those donors over time. All right, so we got through the basics. What's a DAF? What's in it for donors? What's in it for nonprofits? So, at this point of the conversation, we usually hear, okay, great, the opportunity is there, but I have no idea where to get started, right? How do I connect with these donors? What do I actually do to have a fundraising strategy with donor advised funds? So I've got 6 practical tips so that, again, you can go back to your organizations in the near future and get started fundraising from DAF donors as efficiently as possible, because it really isn't as complicated as I think a lot of people might think. So first and foremost, and I come from the data world, so I'm probably biased here, but I think it's really important to have your data updated where donors are going to find your charity. So with a lot of the sponsors, the national sponsors, community foundations, there's 3 key places I recommend starting to claim your profiles and update your data. The first is the Candid GuideStar National Nonprofit Directory. This is a data product which forms the way that a lot of charities or donor advised funds are allowing our donors to search for charities, as well as doing the due diligence about those charities on the back end. So go to Candid, claim your profile, put as much information on there as possible. It's, again, a really easy way to make sure that donors, when they're searching for places to give, can find you and see the impact of your programs. We also recommend doing the same with PayPal so that you're able to receive electronic funds transfer from us and many other donor advised fund sponsors. They have a charities payment program that enables that electronic funds transfer. And Charity Navigator, who, while not part of our website, is where we partner to get information about disaster relief giving. And we also hear from donors. This is a really key external resource they go to frequently to learn more about charities and their impact. Oh, just went back instead of forward. Great. Step 2, make it really clear and easy to give to your organization. So for a lot of donors, one of the first questions they'll ask us is, what type of organization can I give to? And sometimes with various types of nonprofits, they're not totally sure if you can accept donor advised fund grants in the first place. And the good news is most donor advised fund sponsors make grants to almost any 501c3 public charity that is in good standing with the IRS. So if you already know that you fall into that category, I recommend taking a look at your website and your fundraising materials and updating that to make it clear, hey, we accept funds from donor advised funds. The second piece that I recommend here is also making sure that your EIN, or employer identification number, is very prominent on your website and easy to find, and also easy to find in search, because that's how a lot of donors will go and copy and paste that number, come back to our website, enter it in, and find your charity to start a grant. So if you make that really easy, you're removing some of the friction and barriers for donors to make grants to you in the first place. Third, once you start seeing those donor advised fund grants coming in, and I'd hazard a guess that many of your organizations probably already have grants from DAF donors coming in, you want to make sure that you've educated your staff to have a data collection strategy from those grants. Make sure they understand what is a donor advised fund. Make sure they understand how to interpret a grant payment letter. Every single grant that we and others send out tends to come with some information about who is sending the grant. And we see that about 96% of our grants go out with donor information included, but you have to know where to look on that letter to take that, put it into your fundraising databases, and mark that that person was giving with a donor advised fund. Because again, that's a great indicator for your fundraising teams to know there's more money to give here. This might be a major gift relationship we can cultivate. And then fourth, once you've got that data, make sure you're sending your thank you notes, your impact reports, your fundraising materials to that donor, not the donor advised fund sponsor. This is a very common mistake that we see organizations making because, again, the grant letter comes on our letterhead. So they're thinking, great, it's Vanguard Charitable giving me this money. And while that's certainly true, it's our donors who are recommending where that grant goes. And so making sure that all of those communications are routed correctly is a really key part of that fundraising strategy. And then these last 2 tips, they're a little bit more advanced. So I'd say the first 4, that's sort of how you lay the foundations. But if you're ready to step it up a notch, I would also recommend that you think about how you could incorporate donor advised funds into a complex asset and or deferred gift program. A lot of nonprofits tell us we don't have the capacity to do these things ourselves. We don't know how to accept cryptocurrency or artwork or real estate, those complex assets that people might want to donate. Or on the other hand, we don't have the infrastructure to manage an ongoing deferred or legacy gift program. And what's great is that donor advised funds tend to offer these programs at scale, and again, at no cost to the nonprofit themselves. So something to consider if you're working with a donor and they express interest in this type of program, but it's not something that you yourself are able to offer. And then finally, Allison is going to touch on this as well. But even though I just talked about how you want to cultivate your relationship with DAF donors, there are certain grants that you would be able to also receive directly from DAF sponsors. So organizations like Vanguard Charitable or the Delaware Community Foundation. Community foundations, single issue DAFs, they'll often have grant making programs that you can access if you're within that geography, within that issue area. So definitely worth checking out. And then for us national sponsors, we often have what are called field of interest funds, which are, like the name suggests, fields that we are interested in as sponsors, that we have some sort of connection to as an organization. So worth looking into as well. Again, a little bit more advanced strategy for you all. And that's it for my part of the conversation. Glad I didn't lose connectivity again there. And you can see my information here. Happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn and looking forward to the questions at the end of the presentations. Over to you, Allison.
So I'm wondering if we want to address some of the questions before we move to Allison, or if we prefer to address them all at the end.
At the end.
I'm looking at I think I might actually hit some of these questions as we're going through. So that might be one way to handle it. And then we can see what's left.
Awesome. So let's go with you and then we can address the questions together.
Okay.
All right.
Hi
I'm
again,
doing your slide control.
Okay, we'll start at the beginning again. Thank you. Yes, I'm Allison Levine. I'm glad to see some friendly faces on here. Thank you all for being here. I am the publisher and CEO of Spotlight Delaware, a nonprofit newsroom like what many of you are running. And I founded Spotlight about a year ago. And for the 12 years before I launched Spotlight, I worked at the Delaware Community Foundation, where I led marketing and communications, as well as the work around democracy, including local journalism. And for a couple of years, I was kind of doing both jobs at once. So I gained some insight kind of about, grant making and grant seeking at the same time. And I hope some of that will be useful to you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about community foundations, including donor advised funds and also beyond donor advised funds, because there's actually more that you can do with a community foundation than donor advised funds, although that tends to be what we think of them for. So to start with, I wanted to share kind of what a community foundation is and is not, because a lot of folks, including leaders in the industry, have thought for decades that you could just go to your community foundation and access a whole bunch of money from them because they're sitting on tens of millions of dollars. But in fact, most of the money that most community foundations have is sitting in DAFs. And to kind of take it back to the beginning, because I think there were some questions related to this, to be really precise about what a DAF is it's kind of like a bank account. And a community foundation or a Vanguard or a Fidelity, they're different organizations that are kind of like banks. And then the donor advised fund is kind of like a bank account. Am I frozen? I'm frozen for myself, but you can see me?
You're frozen, but we hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, let me try shutting the video off for a second. And then if I can figure out how to do that. All right, then I'll come back. So it's kind of like, okay, yeah, it's telling me my video is not going to run. So, okay, I'll just talk then. You won't see my hand gestures though. A community foundation is kind of a charitable version. And then community foundations existed before some of the private financial institutions were able to start creating donor advised funds. I see what foundation is a DAF, the foundation or the sponsor? That I think is a key question that maybe we're not answering well. Is the community foundation is an organization. It's like it's another nonprofit organization. So a community foundation actually is a 501c3. Vanguard is a private company, and arm of a Vanguard or a Fidelity also can act as a charity. Vicky, please jump in if I'm describing that wrong.
Not at all. We're also
okay.
501c3s, so you got it exactly right.
Exactly. So the Vanguard is an organization. A community foundation is an organization. And then within the organization, there are a bunch of accounts, and those accounts are called donor advised funds. So when people with money want to give money, they go to Fidelity, they go to Vanguard, or they come to a community foundation and they set up an account. And that account is the thing that's called the donor advised fund. So that's kind of bringing it back to the very beginning. And then the idea is that people put their money in the donor advised fund, and they might make a one-time gift into that donor advised fund. And what that does, it allows them to put all the money that they want to give in that fund at one time. So rather than, giving out $10,000 a month over a year, they can put $120,000 in that account, write it off on their taxes, and then they can figure out later how they want to give it away. And that's one of the main reasons that people set up donor advised funds, is so they can put all their money in at once and take a big tax write-off, and then they can think about it later, how they want to give it away. So at a community foundation, most of the money that a community foundation has is usually in donor advised funds. And somebody had put in the chat, who actually has influence over those funds? And that's a great question, because donor advised funds, we're not allowed at community foundations to call them donor directed funds, because legally those dollars belong to the community foundation, or they belong to Vanguard Charitable. They belong to Fidelity Charitable once the donor has made that donation. But they are donor advised. And that means that the organization isn't really going to tell the donor what to do with those funds. We can say things that you're not allowed to do within reason. You can, for example, you almost always have to go to a 501c3 organization. A couple of folks asked in the chat, can it be fiscally sponsored? Yes, because you're using a 501c3. So that's how that works. However, the organization, community foundation or otherwise, can set guidelines. For example, you don't have to allow your donors to give to hate groups. That was one of the things we set up at the Delaware Community Foundation, like a lot of community foundations around the country have done, is set some policies so that you don't have to give to certain groups. Or your board of directors can set policies so you don't have to give to certain groups. Somebody asked about 501c4s. There are ways that donor advised funds can give to different types of organizations, including in some cases to private companies. But it is tricky. And I will say, I don't know about what Fidelity and Vanguard's rules are, but most community foundations will just tell you they can't give to a private company because there's a lot of work and it's difficult and they just don't want to. It can be done. But looking at this graphic, coming back to my graphic here, I'm sharing this because I want to share with all of you that when we go to our community foundation, it might appear that your local community foundation has hundreds of millions of dollars. So you might have the impression that if you go in and ask for $100,000, that's not a big grant for them, right? Because they're sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, it might be a very big grant for them because they probably don't have discretion over the vast majority of the money they have. Most community foundations have a tiny slice of the pie that they have control over. yes, somebody is flagging here that it's worth adding, no two community foundations are the same. Every single, it's a joke kind of in the community foundation world. If you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation. In Delaware, which I have found to be pretty representative of community foundations, we controlled about $600,000 a year of the money that we had. We had $400 million in assets, and about $30 million a year went out from donor-advised funds and scholarships, which meant that the donors were deciding where that money goes. The foundation itself, the community foundation itself, had about $600,000 a year that we were able to decide where that money went. Someone asked, does the staff actually influence the donors who hold these donor-advised funds? That's also different from one community foundation to another, and from one private financial institution to another. My understanding is that at community foundations, we typically would have more guidance. We would give more guidance than at a private financial institution. That typically donors who want to just distribute money the way they want to do it, they would set up with a Vanguard or a Fidelity or another organization like that. If they want a little bit more guidance or to feel like they're part of a movement or something like that, that would be the reason you come to a community foundation, because community foundations usually are more expensive. So the important thing to know here, though, is even if you have a community foundation locally that has $400 million in assets or $1 billion in assets, you probably are not going to be able to go in and just get a massive grant from that organization. They are not, for the most part, going to directly give to any individual cause, whether it's journalism or anything else. Most community foundations are giving money to 500 different causes, not just one. So they don't really focus on a single issue. And that is something that has been confusing to folks over the years, including in the journalism world. So how can you actually access donor-advised funds at community foundations? Keep in mind that the community foundation's role is to help the fund holder achieve their charitable interests. It's not to help you, and it's not to help any other charity. In fact, their role is often to protect the privacy of those donors. One of the reasons that donors set up funds at community foundations or otherwise set up donor-advised funds, sometimes they do that to protect their anonymity so that everybody and their brother can't say, oh, look, that person gave $10,000. Let's go ask them for $10,000. So whether it's through a Vanguard or through a community foundation, you can't just come to us and ask for a list of our donor-advised fund holders. We are not able to give that to you ethically because part of our job is to protect their privacy. What you can do, though, is help the staff at these organizations understand why journalism might be of interest. And when donors are interested in something, the staff members will often give advice or make suggestions, but they are not going to actively work to persuade. If there's a donor-advised fund holder who's really interested in pets or really wants to give money to their local university or wants to help kids with music education, they're probably not going to try to talk them into journalism. So it's our job on the journalism side of things to help staff members understand and hopefully grow passionate about local journalism too. So how do you do this? First is I would suggest make friends with the program team at the community foundation and make sure that they understand exactly why your work is important. And we're going to talk about that in a second, so that they can pitch it to donors on your behalf when they have the opportunity. Go to community foundation events whenever it's possible and try to get their donors, get to know their donors directly. And this is tough because every nonprofit wants to do it, but it is worth a shot. When you are soliciting donors in general, remind them that they can make gifts to you from their DAFs. If they already have one, they may not even think of it. And you may not know if they have a DAF, but if you share out with your donors and your prospects the lists of ways that they can give, then that is kind of a way to prompt them. Tell them you can give by check, credit card, gifts of stock from your donor advised fund, IRA rollovers, etc. And I'll tell you the backdoor way that I learned is you can also get a hold of your community foundation's annual reports, press releases, and announcements of grants. They're usually online, and just go through lists and see if you can figure out who their DAF fund holders are and who might be interested. So even if you can't directly access the DAFs through the community foundations, there are still lots of ways that foundations can help to advance local journalism. But remember, first we have to go back and help them understand why they should care about your issue. So, and for me, it took me a while to have kind of an aha moment that a lot of us are really starting at the beginning in educating funders about the role of local news as a public good. So what I had done at the beginning of this journey that I'm on a couple of years ago was I did a lot of research to really uncover data. And then I made a presentation to a whole bunch of local funders to help them understand why local news is important and how it affects communities. This is very effective across the political spectrum. The loss of local news affects government efficacy, community engagement goes down. We see an increase in polarization and misinformation. And then, of course, inequities are exacerbated. And I'm happy to share this data with anybody if you need it to help persuade your local funders too. Once the funders understand this information, they often become very passionate about this issue, and particularly at community foundations, because community foundations all over the country, as I had said, they're interested in a lot of different things. Community foundations are giving to 1 billion different causes, but I will say probably the majority of community foundations, they're universally interested in community engagement, and they are largely interested in democracy. A lot of them will not use the word democracy now. They will call it civic engagement instead, particularly in more conservative parts of the country. And they are almost all interested in matters of equity. Whether they're willing to talk about racial equity is also different. But once you can get your community foundation leaders to understand that journalism is really just the vehicle, right? What we are talking about is support for democracy and community building. And that is what community foundations care about. And then they might want to help you. They're much more interested in wanting to help you. So what exactly can a community foundation do for you? If you can't walk into the room and just ask them for a list of their funders, what can they do? Some foundations, as I said, have a little bit of money for discretionary grants. Some foundations have a lot of money for discretionary grants. There's a few out there like Silicon Valley and Cleveland. There's some of the big guys who have lots of money for discretionary grants. Most of them don't. Most of them are going to give $5,000 or $10,000 here and there. Go ask, see what the application process is. They're not going to be your major funder, but you may be able to get some small money out of them. In some cases, they actually will have or help you to set up a community news fund, or they might want you to call it a civic engagement fund. So if you can get a group of donors in your community who all want to pitch in, you might be able to persuade them to all go with you to the community foundation to create an account, a donor advised fund that is specifically to support community news. Community foundations often can help you also with loaned resources like website space, sometimes even physical space. And sometimes they're willing to work with you through their social media platforms to at least get the word out. And finally, some of you have mentioned fiscal sponsorship, and that is something that some community foundations will do too, but not all, because there is a cost for them to doing that. So that can be a little tricky. A community foundation also can help you kind of have a gold seal of approval. And this was really important to me in being able to talk with the larger funding community in Delaware. Once I had worn down my community foundation CEO and convinced him that this actually mattered, which took me about 2 years to do, then he was willing to work with me and tell other funders, oh, Allison's talking about something that actually matters here. You should listen to her. So just because he was coming from the community foundation and saying this is an important issue, it helped me get their attention. So that was really helpful. They can also help convene and educate the community because, like I said, we're kind of starting at square one. People are still learning that local news is a public good and why it matters. They're not nerds like the rest of us on this issue. And finally, sometimes they can help you connect to other foundation funders, even if they're not donor advised fund holders. So that is all I have for you, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that I can. I think my camera is just dead, so I'll just have to be invisible.
Well, thank you both for that very informative presentation. I am very sure that we all are learning a lot today. There is a lot of questions in the chat, and I know, Allison, you have already addressed a few of them. So we'll try to get through some of them. We have about 15 minutes to get through some of them. Let me go back to the chat.
I'm actually doing a webinar. Sorry.
We already talked about the DAF staff and how to get them involved. So I'm gonna skip to the other ones. There were questions about how to get around DAFs, like how do we find them and apply to them, and how do we do the wealth screening? So sort of like an operational question. So I'm wondering, maybe Vicky might be the right person to ask these ones. So how do folks can engage with the donors, with the DAFs? How can they find the opportunities as well?
Such a great question. Well, I think there's two sides, or sort of two sides of this that I would consider. First is in your individual, typically if you've got especially like a major gifts program, is going out to your current community of donors and asking, and if anybody gives with a DAF, and making it clear that they can give to you with those donor advised funds. Something that's really important to keep in mind is that DAF donors, this is usually one of many ways they're giving to charities. So in a lot of cases, we see organizations either already have these folks on their mailing list and they're giving through a check, or they're giving through the website. And they may not actually know that they can give to you with that donor advised fund. So that gets back to really making it super clear and really easy to give to your donor, or to give to your organization through a donor advised fund. And of course, then once those gifts start coming in, make sure you mark that in your databases, make sure that's known to the fundraising team. So you can continue to build those relationships over time and tap into that sort of sustainable facet of DAF giving. I think if you're looking at just like the broader, charitable marketplace, not necessarily donors you already know or have relationships with, the other way to think about this is these are just individuals, right? So it's not like going necessarily to a private foundation where you've got to figure out what's the application, do they have a request for proposals, what are the requirements. Really, a donor advised fund strategy should fit in with your broader individual fundraising strategy, just typically with a focus on more high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals, since we do see that wealth tends to be higher in folks that are using donor advised funds. So sort of incorporating that in whatever strategies you're currently employing to reach out to the broader market of high net worth donors. And again, making it really clear and easy to make a grant to you through those donor advised funds is a great place to start. And, don't assume just because somebody's given to you in one way that they don't have a DAF and that's the only way we're giving. That I think is a really common misconception, that you either have a DAF and that's all you give through, or you don't have a DAF and you're just giving directly or giving from a private foundation. These types of donors tend to have many different ways that they're giving. So again, keeping that in mind in your fundraising strategies.
So are you able to see whether they have DAFs when you're doing the wealth screening?
So typically you can't see necessarily whether they have DAFs. I do think that there are some databases which include, whether they've made a donation to Vanguard Charitable, for instance, which would indicate they have a DAF with us, certainly. Most of the time, the way that you're able to tell that someone has a DAF is they either let you know themselves if you've got a, fundraiser conversation with them, or they're giving to your organization through Vanguard Charitable and you're capturing that information. I saw a lot in the chat about the anonymous giving aspect of, how many of these gifts are anonymous. And when you look across the entire space of donor advised funds, there's been some really good research that's been done about this and certainly validates what we see in our data. Less than 4% of grants are anonymous. So typically when you get that grant, you will see the donor's information, their fund name, which is often their name and the fund. And so you want to make sure you're capturing that. And again, indicating in some way, hey, we now know this person has a donor advised fund. So your fundraising team, your marketing team, whoever is working with those donors can keep that in mind in future communications.
So how does a team stay ready, and how do they organize themselves so that they're ready for these opportunities when they arise, specifically for smaller news organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously it really depends on the organization and how your fundraising operation is structured. I think, not to keep coming back to the data, but the data is the foundation, right? So once these opportunities arise, you need some way to keep track of and know that this donor has a donor advised fund and can continue to give to you through that fund. I think, also, again, making it really clear and easy for those donors to do so, making it clear to them, hey, we accept funds from donor advised funds, and here's our EIN. I think for those small organizations that are fiscally sponsored, also being able to educate that donor on, you're going to want to find that fiscal sponsor, that 501c3 that's sponsoring you. And then usually donor advised funds, certainly all of the nationals have an ability to designate a purpose. So like one of our purposes is a specific program or specific project. They're going to then put your information into the fiscally sponsored project of XYZ News Corporation. So I think that is a really good way to make sure that, again, donors know how to give to you and that they can give to you, and making it as easy as possible. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to follow up on the question, please let us know. And I'm also going to put Vicky and Allison's information in the chat so that anybody can follow up with them as well. There were some questions around the current, status, politically status, and whether DAFs, there's any changes in that space. Also, one in particular said, are there any anticipated changes to the tax law that may affect how donors or their DAFs operates? Is there anything coming up on that front?
There's always conversation going on about changing the laws around DAFs, because a lot of people see them as places where charitable dollars go to die. People kind of put money, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars into donor advised funds. And the argument is, well, that should be going out into the community right now to meet needs. On the other hand, some people say, well, it's kind of like your 401k, right? You're building an endowment so that you have money for future charitable needs. So people go back and forth on that. And there's always these threats that they're going to, they're going to start forcing donor advised fund holders to distribute, at least 5% or something per year, which is what they require with private foundations. I'm not sure that it's definitely not part of the current flood the zone strategy that we're seeing. I haven't heard any conversation about donor advised funds among the zone flooding issues. I don't expect that to be a priority in the coming months myself.
Jessica actually asked a question. what if you run a more national program? So how would you suggest getting in front of DAFs? Does it change? Is there any changes in the strategy in that case?
There are national organizations that hold DAFs, and it can depend really on what you're looking for. There are some organizations that hold DAFs for sort of specific interest areas. There's the National Christian Foundation, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's like a federation of DAFs. So, and it has obviously some religious guidelines around it. There are lots of different types of organizations that hold DAFs. I mean, just to be frank, it's really tricky to access DAFs. It's more likely that a DAF is going to identify you. And the question came up about, how do we make I saw it somewhere, how do we make our organization structurally ready to receive a gift from a DAF? I wouldn't worry about that, because most of them, they come as checks or wire transfers. That's not the problem. The challenge is getting donors to recognize you as an organization they want to support. And the people who have a lot of wealth often have DAFs. But if you identify someone who has a DAF, I wouldn't restrict your solicitations to the DAF, because if they have a DAF, they probably have other resources. So really what you're trying to do is get them to give you resources. It doesn't matter if they come, from their checkbook or their checking account or the DAF.
Good point. Somebody was asking about, this is probably for Vicky, about whether Vanguard does events so that folks can learn a little bit more about DAFs. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of educational for either journalists or folks in general.
So I guess if the question is more so for resources for nonprofits to learn more about DAFs, we actually have a whole nonprofit website, which I can share in the chat, that includes lots of information that I shared here today, and I'm sure a ton of information that I did not. So that's a really great place to start to educate yourself, your staff about donor advised funds. And then if the question was really about, do we have events with our donors similar to those that Allison mentioned, sometimes community foundations have. We don't, because of the national basis of our donors. So, we typically will have, for instance, disaster relief lists that help people to connect with charities and that are responding to a disaster in a specific area. Other types of digital tools help raise awareness and educate about what giving opportunities there might be. But again, because we're a national donor advised fund, harder to get together in person. So, well, we would love to. I don't think that that's something that we currently offer.
That's fair. And I know Carson Walker had his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, I've been contemplating, great timing, great presentation, because we get a fair amount from DAFs. And I've also talked to one of the community foundations about doing some legacy giving or setting it up. So basically donors could start a relationship with these foundations and give to us. And so this is what we're working on this year. Do you have a boilerplate? I'm thinking like a brochure that we would only send to those high-end donors that we have in the wealth screen that I know have wealth, and just to kind of spell out, here are all the options once we get those together. Is that something that we could do, is just basically a respectful letter saying, basically, thank you for your donations, and here are how you could give at that higher level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a donor brochure that I'd be happy to share with the group that goes through some of these, ways that you can give, ways you can use a donor advised fund. So I can share that with Diana to send out to the participants today so that everybody can have access to that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to hear that you're having those conversations. Very, very sophisticated strategy.
All right, we have a few minutes left, so I want to open up the floor. I love that, Carson, you raised your hand. So if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask your question, this is your chance. We try to cover as many of the questions in the chat, but there were a lot. So Carrie, go ahead.
Hi, this has been really incredibly informative. Thank you so much. Is there, just kind of like what he was saying, is there a way to to understand better, like, oh no, I just lost my train of thought. I mean, it's coming back, I promise, but let somebody else go.
All right. Anybody else has a question while Carrie prepares? All right, John. Oh, you're still muted.
There have been a couple variations of this. A lot of us are journalists. We're very good at finding people. So we've gotten a couple DAF donations, and all we've had is the name. And we've found like family members. Is it appropriate, or is that like gonna tick people off when they're like, hey, we gave you a contribution, we didn't want to be bugged? What's the balance between finding the people behind the money and respecting their privacy?
Such a great question, John. Well, for our donors, typically, if they don't want to be found, they will use the anonymous giving option. So a lot of the time, I actually hear donors are sad that they don't hear more from nonprofits when they give with their DAF. I think most donors, when they share their account name, for instance, and their name is very clearly a part of that account name, they're thinking they're going to get some kind of thank you, maybe going to get some kind of outreach. So I think it's absolutely appropriate to reach out to them, and then also to make sure you're giving the opportunity to opt out of those communications. All individuals can react differently to that. So as long as you're giving the option, I think that that's what most donors appreciate and are looking for. But I more frequently hear, wish I heard more from the nonprofits that I grant to.
All right. Before we go, I'm going to let Carrie ask your question.
My apologies. There's a mission of a community news fund. How would that work with a DAF? Would it mean that that fund is like a pooled fund that would be distributed, or is that a community news fund that then highlights the different options you can give to under that fund?
It's kind of a concept, honestly, that is done different ways in different communities and sometimes not done at all. But Vicky alluded to something called a field of interest fund, which is kind of like a donor advised fund, except it is focused on a specific field of interest, a specific issue. So in some communities, community foundations have identified donors, or donors have come to them to set up a fund specifically to benefit local news. Sometimes a community foundation's leadership will take the initiative and go to the donors or go to the community and say, we want to set up a fund specifically to support local news. Or sometimes an individual donor might have a pre-existing interest in that. And they can be set up as field of interest funds where that money is automatically dispersed to specific organizations. They can also be done as a donor advised fund, which they kind of can rename. And again, every foundation, community foundation does this differently, but some of them will do what's called a committee advised fund. So instead of donor advised by an individual, it is advised by a committee. And they will put together a little committee that says, okay, this year, this is a $100,000 fund this year. And that's another important thing I'm not sure we've talked about is donor advised funds are very often endowed funds. The point of them is to be endowed funds. So if there's $100,000 in that fund, they are not looking to give away $100,000. They are looking to take a slice of the earnings from that fund and give that slice away. So a $100,000 fund is going to earn $5,000 in a year, and they want to give away half of that, for example. So a $100,000 fund is making $2,500 in grants. It's very often confusing, but that is how some places are doing community news funds, and that's also kind of aligned with what you might be hearing about from the Press Forward movement. A lot of community foundations that are working with Press Forward, they're setting up essentially community news funds under the banner of Press Forward.
That makes sense. Thank you, Allison.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we are a little bit over time, so I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you to Allison and Vicky for your wonderful presentation. We are going to be following up with an email with the slides, the recording, the chat, which I just saved, and the resources shared as well in the chat. And the research that Vicky is going to share as well. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.